Good afternoon, and welcome to our special program from the National Museum of the Pacific War in collaboration with the United States Army Heritage and Education Center. I'm Kina Stiles, Director of Education and Museum Programs, and I'm honored to be your host. Today, we deep dive into one of the most pivotal and costly battles of the Pacific War, the Battle of Okinawa. Over the next 90 minutes, we're going to explore this battle through three perspectives: command, combat, and kamikazes, through a panel of experts to really understand the decisions, conditions, and consequences that defined it. But first, I want to thank everyone for joining us today from across the globe. We have viewers from Argentina to Arkansas and Portugal to Pennsylvania, and it really is a privilege for us to bring these stories to life for such a wide audience. As I mentioned, we are going to be approaching Okinawa in three parts with some special guests. First, Command with Christopher Kolakowski, examining the leadership and legacy of General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. Next, Combat with Stephen Simmel, drawing from rare archival accounts of the 77th Infantry Division. And finally, Kamikazes with Jon Parshall, exploring the naval dimension and the devastating suicide attacks. And of course, we want to hear from you too at the end, and we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. But first, we want to introduce our first speaker, who is Christopher Kolakowski, Director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Chris has served in historical and preservation roles across the United States. He has authored 6 books on military history and is a senior fellow at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. Today, he's going to take us into the story of General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commander of the 10th Army, whose leadership and ultimate sacrifice shaped the course of Okinawa's ground campaign. His latest book, 10th Army Commander, explores Buckner's wartime leadership and legacy. So, Chris, the floor is yours.
So thanks everybody for joining me today, joining us for this great panel discussion. In the section that I have, I want to talk about somebody who's kind of a silent voice for reasons that we'll discuss in the Battle of Okinawa, but is one of the central figures in the Battle of Okinawa. And I'm talking specifically about the commander of U.S. 10th Army, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. He's something of a cipher in some ways around the battle because he doesn't survive. He gets killed in action. He's actually the senior American killed by enemy fire in all of World War II and in all the 20th century when he falls to Japanese artillery fire on June 18th, 1945, toward the end of the Battle of Okinawa. And so what that does is that removes a very important voice. And that's something that, frankly, needs to be brought out again. And so in the time that I have today, I want to talk about General Buckner, and I want to talk about the battle from his perspective, and give people kind of perhaps a little bit more of a sense or some other things to think about, because there were some controversies even then and now about his conduct of the Battle of Okinawa. I did last year publish the first full publication of his letters and diaries from 1944 and 1945. And he wanted to write a memoir. He was preparing for a memoir. Unfortunately, obviously, that was never written. So this is the only written, in his voice, the written record that we still have today. Now, Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. was born in 1886. When he fights the Battle of Okinawa, he's 58 years old. West Point class of 1908, long service in the pre-war U.S. Army, had been in the Philippines as an infantryman, had actually taken flight training and drilled air cadets during World War I. He did not get over and see combat. Also was a part of the West Point faculty, first as a tactical officer in the years immediately after World War I, and then came back later as commandant of cadets from 1933 to 1936. And in between those periods, he became something of an educator, something of a kind of some people called him the Army's schoolmaster. He was at Command and General Staff College, and then immediately after being a student, stayed on as an instructor. Army War College, student, stayed on as an instructor and an administrator, and then, of course, commandant of cadets. And when he comes out of that in 1936, he'll spend the rest of his life commanding troops, 1st Infantry Regiments, a tank regiment, actually, the 66th Infantry Light Tanks. And then ultimately, he'll be one of the first officers of his class to be promoted to Brigadier General in 1940. He is tapped by George Marshall to take command of the defenses of Alaska, which is where a lot of people know who General Buckner is. This is a wartime map of Alaska. And just to give you an idea, somebody pointed out one of his engineers pointed out that Buckner was given a 10-year job that he did in about a year and a half, because he shows up in the late summer of 1940. Of course, the Japanese at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. When Buckner gets to Alaska, virtually all the military installations that you see on this map are not constructed. Alaska has about 400 people and one cannon as its defenses, and the cannon is an old Russian muzzleloader from the 19th century that's a monument. By the time Pearl Harbor is bombed, there's over 22,000 in defense. There's several dozen aircraft, and then of course Alaska will be reinforced after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese will invade the western part of the Aleutians there. You can see Attu and Kiska there in the western part. And Buckner, along with the Navy and along with air units under his command, will be responsible for kicking them out, which ultimately happens in the summer of 1943. First with the Battle of Attu in May of 1943, and then Kiska, which ultimately proved to be an unopposed landing in August of 1943. So Buckner, by late 1943, has demonstrated an ability to work with the Navy, to work in very complex environments, to really, handle himself as a joint, what we would call today in a modern parlance, a joint warfare commander. And it is that resume that inspires the Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, to tap Buckner to command the field army that will be forming in Honolulu for future operations in the Central Pacific. And in June of 1944, Buckner will move to Honolulu and take command of U.S. 10th Army. Now, when Buckner takes command of 10th Army, the Pacific War is at a real juncture. Here's a map of the Pacific. This is the Pacific up till February of 1945. North being at the top, of course, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, Alaska, Canada, the United States, the continental United States. Up in the upper left-hand corner is the Soviet Union. Directly below the Soviet Union is China. The red areas are Japanese occupied. The other parts are Allied. Directly south of China, of course, is India, French Indochina, which we know today as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Also British Malaysia, Malaya at the time. Indonesia, which at the time was the Netherlands East Indies, just to the east of that. You can see Australia right down there in the bottom center of the map. Directly north of Australia is New Guinea. And then a variety of islands in between. You can see those red splotches that are occupied by the Japanese, and I'll talk more about some of that in just a second. Directly northwest of New Guinea, you see the Philippines, kind of straggling up in that area. Directly north of the Philippines is Formosa. And then northeast of Formosa is Japan itself, kind of in the upper left center of the map there. Between Formosa and Japan itself is the island of Okinawa and the Ryukyu Island chain. From Japan, you go east, and you'll see just over the international date line is the island of Midway, and then southeast of Midway is Hawaii. Hawaii to San Francisco is 2,000 miles. Hawaii to Manila in the Philippines, 5,000 miles. The continental United States is 3,000 miles wide, so you can sink the continental United States with room to spare between Honolulu and Manila. So it's a huge area that the Pacific has been. And when Buckner arrives in Honolulu, the Pacific War has been going well for the United States. After the Battle of Midway, Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, which is northeast of Australia, there have been two drives that have started to move across the Pacific. Douglas MacArthur coming out of Australia along the New Guinea coast back towards the Philippines. And meanwhile, Chester Nimitz Central Pacific Forces, which Buckner will be subordinated to, coming out of Honolulu and going straight across the Pacific, island hopping, back also toward the Philippines. When Buckner first arrives, one of the things that he is first tasked with is to plan an invasion, but not of Okinawa, of Formosa. There's a strategic debate right now in the War Department and in the Navy Department in Washington over what should be the objectives when the two drives come together. Should they come together in the Philippines? Should they come together at Formosa and the China coast? And if they come together at Formosa, Buckner is going to be the ground commander designate. Ultimately, after a considerable consideration and planning, he recommends to Nimitz that we can't do Formosa unless we get reinforcements from the continental United States, which are earmarked for Europe, and they're not going to stop the war in Europe to take one island in the Pacific. So Buckner, while MacArthur gets his return to the Philippines, Buckner gets a new assignment, which is the invasion of Okinawa in the Ryukyus. with a target date ultimately of April 1st, 1945. And the plan is to take Okinawa as a naval base and as an air base in preparation for what everybody expects to be the climactic battle of the Pacific War, which is the invasion of the Japanese home islands itself. Buckner will be the ground commander designate for U.S. 10th Army in the invasion. He will work closely with Admiral Raymond Spruance of the Fifth Fleet, and of course be subordinated directly to Admiral Nimitz as well. So let's look at the plan of attack here for Okinawa. Okinawa, by the way, is a long island. It's 62 miles in length. At its narrowest point, it's 2 miles in width. At its widest point, it's 15 miles in width. There are 400,000 Japanese on the island, this residence. There's 120,000 defenders under the command of a guy named Ushijima, Mitsuru Ushijima, who had previously been commander of the Japanese Military Academy. The plan is to land on the island, secure the island, first the southern part, then the northern part, and then some offshore islands as well. That's the general plan of attack, and I'll give some more details here in just a second. One of the things that needs to be mentioned very quickly about Okinawa is its terrain. The island is generally very rolling in the southern part of the island. The central part, which is ultimately where 10th Army will land, tends to be much more flat. There's a reason why there were air bases there, and there are still U.S. air bases there today. And then the northern part tends to be more mountainous. Okinawa also is a prefecture of Japan. It is represented in the Japanese legislature, and this is the closest island to the home islands itself yet attacked by Allied forces. And I say Allied because there's going to be British ships that are involved in the fleet offshore. They're only 350 miles from the southern part of the Japanese home islands in Kyushu, 500 miles to Formosa, 350 miles to Shanghai. So you can see kind of you're in the middle of a lot of Japanese positions and defenses, and it's going to make a huge impact. Buckner has 183,000 people, men in the invasion force. Significant part are Army. Vast majority of his forces are U.S. Army, 24th Corps in particular. But also a significant part of his Army is U.S. Marines. And that's something that should be mentioned, except for 5th Army in Italy, 10th Army is the only field army that contained a significant part of U.S. Army, of non-U.S. Army troops in its existence. And in previous battles, which may be something we explore in the Q&A, it has not always gone well when the Army and the Marines try and work together. But Buckner, through personal influence, personal relationships, he actually knew the Marine commander Roy Geiger really well from their time at the Command and General Staff College. That personal relationship goes a long way towards smoothing over any sort of inter-service differences. In fact, a Marine historian said, if you want to study inter-service cooperation, Okinawa is an outstanding example of it. And that's true with Buckner's relations with the amphibious Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, of course, Admiral Spruance. That goes a long way, those relationships, and Buckner's friendliness and his willingness to work together and understand other people's perspectives, which he learned in Alaska, go a long way towards smoothing those relations. So here's the plan. Here's the invasion plan itself. You can see there they're going to land on the west coast of Okinawa at the beaches of Higuchi on April 1st. They're also going to secure in the southwestern part, a few days before, the Karama Reto, the Karama Archipelago, as a fleet anchorage, just in case something happens, and it'll ultimately be a very valuable fleet anchorage and repair area for the kamikaze attacks, which I know Jon will address. So also notice about the plan two things. Number one, Higuchi was one of the two best places to land, but there was a second option, and it's down in the southeast corner there of the map, and you can see the 2nd Marine Division will faint there on April 1st in Minatoga. We'll come back to Minatoga and why it wasn't selected and why it continues to kind of loom out there as an option. But also the other thing, look at the map, look at the phase lines. If you can look closely at those phase lines, you'll notice the dotted line is how far they expect to get across the island. And you'll notice that it's marked L, for Love Day, which is the day that the invasion happened, L plus 15. So they're expecting 2 weeks to get across the island. However, they didn't count on Ushijima. Ushijima had realized that the idea of trying to meet the Americans on the beach, particularly with the air and sea power that the American landing forces will bring, is suicidal. His objective is to try and bleed the Americans and hold on as long as he can in the island. So what he does is he puts a small detachment in northern Okinawa, puts a small detachment in central Okinawa, very small, and the bulk of his army, 120,000 personnel, are dug in all through the southern part of Okinawa, and they create what has been called by naval historians the most formidable defenses of the entire Pacific War. And he has built a concentric series of defense rings centered on the area known as Shuri Castle. If you see the urban area there of Naha in the bottom center of the map, just to the east of there is Shuri, which was the ancient capital of Okinawa. And so when Buckner's troops land, they don't find much opposition. In fact, there's a soldier of the 7th Infantry Division who walks ashore a few hundred yards, turns and says to nobody in particular, "I've already lived longer than I thought I would." So within 3 days, they've cut the island in two. And at this point, Buckner makes one of the two most important decisions of the campaign. The original plan was phase one, secure southern Okinawa, then secure northern Okinawa. He decides to hit out in all directions. And he tells the Marines, all restrictions on your movement northward are removed. And it unleashes 3rd Amphibious Corps, unleashes the Marines, and in 2 weeks, northern Okinawa is secured, as are the offshore island of Aishima. Meanwhile, the Army's 24th Corps turns south and very quickly finds the hard nut of Japanese resistance. As the commander, John Hodge, would say, we're going to have to blast them out yard by yard. And that's exactly what happens over the following weeks. Some of the heaviest bombardment of the Pacific War occur in April during some of the offensives as the 10th Army pushes ever further south. By late April, Buckner faces the other important decision that he will make in the campaign. Now, I mentioned there's 120,000 Japanese defenders. Until almost the end of the battle, 10th Army intelligence assumed there were only 60 to 70,000 Japanese defenders on the island. Okay, so that's something that needs to be remembered. As Buckner, the Marines are now available in northern Okinawa. 77th Division, which had secured Aishima, is now available as well. There becomes a debate about what to do. Because the battle is not progressing. In fact, Nimitz visits and says, I'm losing a ship and a half a day because of these kamikazes. Get this line moving. So there's a lot of pressure on Buckner. And there's some pressure from some people to land at Minatoga. The problem is the reason Minatoga was rejected, and Buckner will consider it again, but ultimately reject it, is the beaches are not as good to supply over. But the big thing is, as soon as you move inland, you run right into hills. Turns out the Japanese had fortified those hills and stationed a brigade there, and where Ushijima was itching for a landing at Minatoga. Buckner looks at the situation. He realizes a couple of things and what he's trying to do. He can land at Minatoga, but it's out of support range of the main army. And as he will tell his staff, it would be another Anzio, but worse. And if you know anything about the 1944 campaign, you realize the near disaster of Anzio without support from the main line of 5th Army in Italy. So there's that. The other thing is Buckner's divisions have been fighting for a month, and they're pretty exhausted. There's one platoon in the 96th Division, 44 men came ashore. By the end of April, only 11 have not been killed or wounded. And that's representative of most of the troops in the front. So they're exhausted. The troops on the front line are exhausted. They need some relief. They need reset, refit. The other thing is the Americans have been counting bodies. And it appears that the Japanese, remember that estimate, it appears that the Japanese are getting close to the end of their manpower. We know that's not the case, but Buckner's intelligence is telling him, hey, Ushijima's running out of strength. They're running out of people. And if we can do one more push and take Shuri, we're probably going to win the battle. So you put those things together. And actually, Admiral Turner, Buckner talks to Turner a lot about this. And Buckner's chief of staff later says, Buckner really wanted to land at Minatoga. But after considering everything, realized, can't do it. Can't do it. Not a good idea. So He instead commits the rest of his army into a frontal attack on Shuri. Admiral Turner, by the way, agreed with the decision after discussing it with Buckner. He said, "I'll do whatever you want," but he agreed with the decision. And so ultimately, in heavy fighting in May, they'll take Shuri. Ushijima will withdraw to the southern part of Okinawa for a last stand. And it is while visiting the 8th Marine Regiment, which is going into action for the first time on Okinawa on June 18th, 1945, General Buckner visits the headquarters. This photograph is taken. Shortly after this photograph is taken, having watched the Marines go into action, Buckner will say, "It's going so well, I'll move on to another unit." And just as he says that, a shell hits that rock behind him from a Japanese gun. A Japanese shell hits that rock. Buckner gets struck in the chest, begins gasping for air, is carried to the back where the regimental surgeon begins to work on him. And a Marine private grasps his hand and says, "You're going home, General. You're homeward bound." And that's what Buckner hears as he gasps his last breath. June 18th, 1945, in the early afternoon. Roy Geiger, Marine General Roy Geiger, commander of 3rd Amphibious Corps, takes over as the interim commander of 10th Army and ultimately will be replaced a few days later by Joseph Stilwell. Roy Geiger is the first Marine and the only aviator of any service to command a field army in combat. At the end of the war, Buckner's family decides they're given the choice, just like any other deceased service member, and they bring him home, and he's buried in 1949 next to his parents in Frankfort, Kentucky, not far from Daniel Boone's grave, as a matter of fact. But that's a little bit in the time that we've had today. That's a little bit about General Buckner, and hopefully gives you a little bit better feel for who he was and his command decisions, and perhaps illuminates a little bit more his thinking during the battle. And I'm looking forward to questions and further discussion. So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Chris. Your work not only brings General Buckner's leadership into focus, but it also reminds us how dangerous inaccurate intelligence can be, in this case, underestimating Japanese defenders by nearly half. So thank you again. We are now going to move to the front lines. Our next speaker brings us to the Army's campaign on Okinawa through the archives. These records don't just recount the battle, but they're going to capture it in the words of those who lived it. Stephen Simmel is a technical information specialist with the United States Army Heritage and Education Center at the United States Army War College. His research takes us to the experiences of the 77th Infantry Division during Operation Iceberg, particularly in Iwo. Stephen, welcome.
Good afternoon and welcome to the United States Army Heritage and Education Center section of the presentation. We're going to be focusing on Iwo through an archival analysis. This is going to focus on the 77th Infantry Division during Phase 2 of Operation Iceberg. For the historical section, I wanted to kind of dive into the fact that these items are all here at the United States Army Heritage and Education Center. There are going to be no outside photographs or collections used for this presentation. So based off this archival analysis, there's several documents that we're going to be kind of going through, and the responses of the soldiers talking about Iwo, in particular Paul Leach. Paul Leach is the combat historian for the 77th Infantry Division and has a very strong response based off of the essentially war correspondents' reaction to the death of an individual by the name of Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle dies on the island of Iwo on April 18th, and most war correspondents are going to indicate that it's a shame that he died on Iwo because it's an insignificant little island. Paul Leach, knowing how much the 77th sacrificed on the island, says that this insignificant little island was a possible reason why the war changed to the way that it did, especially for Okinawa and even the end of the Pacific Theater. But based off of these kind of accounts back and forth, what do these documents reveal about the resistance that these soldiers face? Not only that, but also the impact of Iwo on how it impacts the victory for Okinawa, but also what does it lead towards understanding about what would happen if we invaded mainland Japan. One of the sub-questions that ended up happening throughout this case study was the high cases of combat fatigue or battle fatigue that were taking place on Iwo. So what do the soldiers run into based off of this that causes this issue? So just to kind of give a little bit of an overview over Operation Iceberg Phase 2, is going to focus on the island of Ieshima. The photo that you see on the right is an aerial view of the island, but also its location to Okinawa on the western shore of the island. You can actually see one of the peninsulas on the upper half of the image. The location of Okinawa is evident based off this photo, but also the airfield readiness that the U.S. forces could use to not only conduct aerial operations on Okinawa, but also if they decided to bombard Japan, it's not too far away, roughly about 325 miles. And the unit assigned, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, to this combat operation is the 77th Infantry Division, under the command of Major General Andrew D. Bruce. Now, to kind of dive a little bit more into the 77th, we need a little bit of a background. The background of the 77th Infantry Division is quite unique. The median age of the unit is roughly about 32 years old compared to the rest of the median age of divisions in World War II, which was about 20 to 22 years old. The veterans also went through a vigorous training regimen before they even were deployed to the Pacific. They were activated in 1942. They go to Louisiana for kind of training outside of Camp Polk from December to February of 42 to 43. And then they also get moved to the Chesapeake Bay to learn amphibious landing operations using the USS Henrico, which I'll mention a little bit later. They also go through training in Arizona for desert training. They head out to Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. They go through mountain training in West Virginia. And then once they are assigned to the Pacific, they go into Hawaii to do jungle training. The veteran versus replacement dynamic is rather interesting because of this. Most of the replacements that are involved in Ieshima are all brought into the unit after Leyte. The veterans, as you can tell, based off the amount of cohesion through the multitudes of training, have a little bit of a different dynamic than the replacements. The replacements are very focused on maintaining their weapon, but also not very familiar with the unit's veterans themselves. One of the best ways to kind of summarize this is SLA Marshall's analysis with men under fire. He indicates that a veteran soldier, would rather fight unarmed with their surrounding comrades than a new replacement that would focus more on fighting with the best weapon available. The 77th's previous assignment before their operation on Ieshima is the capture of Karamarito Islands. They captured 6 islands in less than 3 days at the end of March 1945, right before the Battle of Okinawa begins. One of the main aspects of this operation is they capture several suicide boats, one of which is depicted down below on the second image of this slide. After they capture Karamarito, there are several suicide boats that are captured by the 77th Infantry Division. Andrew D. Bruce takes this opportunity to give one as a souvenir to an individual that's very near and dear to this organization that we're presenting for today, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Chester Nimitz and Andrew D. Bruce were very close, both Texans. Andrew Bruce's letters that you see on the screen on the far left is the gift of one of these suicide boats to Admiral Chester Nimitz to use on a lake in Texas for his fishing expeditions. The 2 letters that you see on the middle and the right are his responses to Andrew Bruce. All these items I mentioned are in a collection, and they have a very humorous back and forth conversation about the suicide boats he used for fishing, but also just some general correspondence back and forth, including the capture of Ieshima. Now, the Japanese preparations of the island. The image that you see on the right comes from the combat operation report, kind of breaking down the type of combatants that the 77th will face in this operation. As you can see, there's roughly 2,000 military personnel, included some conscript, roughly about 580 of them. But the big indication is the amount of civilians that were armed and supplied by the Japanese army. Roughly about 1,500 of them are going to be standing up in their own defenses against the United States forces that are going to hit this position, and roughly 3,500 on paper. Some estimate roughly about 5,000. Not only do we have these defenders that are going to be causing confusion with the U.S. forces, but the tunnel system that's going to take place on a location known as the Pinnacle in the center of the island. It is the only part of that island that is above sea level. Most of it is a flat terrain. That's why it was a great airstrip. But this pinnacle, as they refer to, is going to be about 3 stories high of tunnel systems that lead into the town of Iya. The fences are going to focus on 2 aspects. It's going to be an integral tunnel system in the center of Iagisu Yama, which is the pinnacle, roughly about 600 feet above sea level, on a relatively flat island, that is going to connect into the town of Iya. This pinnacle could provide a great observation point for the Japanese defenders, but also a way to go into the town and back into the center of the pinnacle. The second aspect of this is the numerous explosive traps scattered across the island. These explosives are going to be anywhere from 5 grenades with tripwire to landmines to actual proper mines to 500-pound naval aerial bombs. So that you can kind of see, based off the type of defenses they're going to have, it might provide a lot stiffer resistance than they faced on Kurama Rito. Now, the landing operations for Iyashima. This landing off of the map that you see here actually has penciled in several beachheads along the way. You can see green 1, red 1 through 4, and blue 1 through 4. General Andrew D. Bruce had this philosophy during most of the Pacific campaign: land them where they ain't. His aspect of this is going to focus on landing their forces on beachheads that are not heavily defended. Well, they may appear heavily defended by rifle fire during observations, or you can kind of see firing and defenses along different beaches. This is going to kind of show that anything that shows heavily defending most likely does not have a lot of support, whereas locations that seem pretty clear actually have a large network of defenses that the Japanese are using for deception. The tunneling system based off of the pinnacle are also going to indicate that aerial photography may not give the best perspective of what actual number of defenders are there, because most of them are going to be hidden underground or hidden from that view shed. This operation is going to primarily focus on beaches green 1, red 1, and red 2. With them landing on the western side of the island, they're going to sweep west to east towards the pinnacle in the town of Iya. And to capture the island, they'll need to capture the pinnacle to do so. Now, the 77th is going to be placed in floating reserve during this time period. While they're out at sea before they land on W Day, which is going to be April 16th, a Japanese kamikaze plane hits the USS Henrico, which is going to be the troop transport ship for the 305th Regimental Combat Team. Colonel Vincent Tanzola, who is the commander of the 305th, as well as the majority of the command suite for the 305th, is wiped out based off this kamikaze plane. They lose 22 killed, 76 wounded, and 10 missing, including the commanding officer of the USN Henrico. 48 sailors are killed and 120 are wounded. This takes a major blow to the morale of the 305th as well as the rest of the division because of how well respected Tanzola was. Not only this, as a lot of soldiers will go into the concern that the loss of Tanzola and the command suite means that they're going to have a whole new slew of officers that have not taken command in a combat operation to this level after this. Now, the landing itself is going to take place on April 16th. The forces of the 305th and the 306th Regimental Combat Teams are going to land on Iyashima on the west on green 1, red 1, and red 2. Beaches green 1 and red 1 face very little resistance, with those forces sweeping half the island by midday. Red 2 face a little bit more stiffer resistance due to its location to the town of Iya, but most of them will cover half the island by the time they get to outside the town of Iya. Navigation of the minefields causes a little bit of concerns. This is the first time that these soldiers are going to be dealing with the impromptu explosives. There's one scenario where a Jeep running wounded back to the beachhead runs over one of the sea mines that are dug underground, and the only thing that is left is a piece of scrap metal. There is no evidence of the soldiers that were on the Jeep. They're realizing that these landmines are not the actual landmines they dealt with before. Most of the resistance, as I mentioned, is going to be faced outside of the town of Iya. On April 17th and 18th, moving on into the campaign, most of the 77th Division has cleared the island halfway through past the airfields. However, the miles gained on day one shrank to hundreds of yards. They start facing very heavy resistance. They start running into more mines. They're actually running into soldiers executing bonsai charges. Most of these bonsai suicide bombers essentially are going to be using satchel charges and trying to blow holes in the lines that the 77th Infantry Division are trying to push through the island. The Japanese defenders, however, could see every move that the 77th Division was making from the pinnacle, which is an image that you see on the top of the screen here. That is one of the main difficulties that these soldiers are going to run into. Not only that, but because of the type of mines, the bomb explosive unit that's removing these mines from these beaches, there's very few or if any left because of being blown up by the mines that they're not used to defusing. The fighting is very stiff. They can't move very far, and they're running into a lot of issues along those lines. One of the main morale boosters that these soldiers are going to start running into is by the man of Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle arrives on Ieshima on April 17th using the USS Cabot, and he joins up with the 305th Regimental Combat Team. As I mentioned with the loss of Tanzola, this little boost of morale may help them. He's a well-known war correspondent, mostly for his assignment in the European theater. He's assigned to the Pacific in 1945 in January, and it's a morale boost to the enlisted. John Kreisman, who's a part of the 77th Infantry Division, is going to say a soldier's mail was so heavily censored his family could find little or nothing about his whereabouts yet. But by reading Ernie Pyle's reporting, many mothers and fathers found their only source of information about their son's actions. This gives a little bit of an indication of a morale boost. It also shows the importance of Ieshima to the families of those of the 77th Infantry Division. However, on April 18th, Ernie Pyle is going to travel with Lieutenant Colonel Coolidge for the 305th. He is the one that takes over for Tanzola after he's killed on April 2nd. The Jeep comes under Japanese machine gun fire, and Ernie Pyle is killed by one of those machine gun bullets. The telegram that you see on the screen is from Joseph Forrestal, indicating to Mrs. Pyle her husband's death. Andrew Bruce feels very personal about the loss of Ernie Pyle, and he writes a letter to Mrs. Pyle, which is the letter you see on the second half of the letter you see on the left, and the image that you see on the right is Mrs. Pyle's response to Bruce's letter, indicating the generous regards for the information that he was able to provide her. And these are some other images that you'll see, including Ernie Pyle's last rites, some individuals that telegram Mrs. Pyle about her death, the marker of the location where Ernie Pyle is buried on Ieshima, some notes to make Bruce Cabot, a famous actor, is one of the telegrams, as well as Joseph Stilwell. Now, after the settling of the death of Ernie Pyle, they're still facing many stiff resistance on the outside of Ia, especially Government House Hill and Bloody Ridge. The image that you see at the top is Government House Hill. After many back and forth aspects of this position, more and more soldiers are going to start reacting very poorly to the intensity of the combat. A lot of replacements are going to start dealing with combat fatigue, including some after charging through minefields. Some individuals will freeze. Some start firing their rifle into the air sporadically. Some are shaking uncontrollably, just based off the intensity of the next several days. A lot of these soldiers are given a shot of some sort of medication and sent to the rear. But based off this fighting, it's going to be a drawn-out slugfest for the next several days. Once Government House Hill is captured, they move further upon the Pinnacle. The Pinnacle is finally captured on April 21st. The image of the American flag flown above is on top of the Pinnacle itself. Andrew D. Bruce is declare the island is secure on April 21st, and the mop-up operations take up roughly about 5 days. Now, the operation report of Phase 2 for Ieshima. This comes from Paul Leach and Andrew Bruce's collection. They both have their own copy of this. And there's some very interesting information that comes out of this report. It has some sort of indication that they believe that this information will be released to the public, even though it is it's a secret classification document until it's declassified. But they want the story of Ieshima to get out to the public. The medical report is very striking in terms of what is indicated. You can see that the increased cases of neuropsychological trauma take place. But not only that, but they don't have a lot of interviews because of the rapidness of the action. And they also didn't have any neuropsychologically trained personnel on the island. And also the severity of the casualties themselves. A lot of them have compound fractures. A lot of them are wounds from shell fragments. More wounds are caused by shell fragments than small arms fire for both the killed casualties as well as the wounded casualties. But also they started to indicate lessons learned about the infantry. There's an indication in the report that said even veterans became careless about dispersion, careless about sniper fire, careless about locating command posts, careless about wearing steel helmets, and careless about digging, showing that just this pretty much strain on the soldiers has gone over that time period. Another aspect of this is the casualties. The division suffered the same number of casualties in 6 days on Ieshima that they did than 22 days on Guam. They lose 239 soldiers killed in action, 879 wounded, and 19 missing. So that roughly 1,100 casualties out of the 21,000 total strength going into Okinawa shows kind of a major blow to the division. However, that 21,000 is not all actively engaged on Ieshima. It just shows the depth of the issues that they run into. This little action that was indicated, most thought that was going to take a day. It takes 6 days, and it shows how many casualties that these men faced on the island. Now, in conclusion, the importance of Ieshima for the 77th Infantry Division. Based off the main problems that these soldiers ran into, the amount of men that they lost, veteran and replacement units, and just the ferocity of the defenders dealing with bonsai charges, dealing with women, children, elderly, civilians, fighting against them with spears, fighting with satchel charges, blowing themselves up to take out as many of them as possible, causes a lot of indications of what could happen if they would go and invade mainland Japan. Now, the causes of combat fatigue are very evident just based off the severity of the combat, the uses of multiple types of explosives, and also what could happen if they invaded mainland Japan. Would they face the same civilian resistance that would join the military forces on mainland Japan, or would they see something completely different? But this also kind of carries into the rest of the Okinawa campaign of what's the defenses are going to fight against, how vigorous the fighting is going to be, and how dug in these forces are going to be. And some lessons learned from this action. What would this reflect for mainland Japan, but also how the division is going to carry forward through this. Now, one of the things I'm going to be able to send out to some folks is the combination of PDFs. There's a lot that I can cover with this, the amount of boxes of material that are there, but I'm going to be able to create a PDF and send this out of documents of the different soldiers that were interviewed by Gerald Astor, who wrote the Operation Iceberg, Andrew Bruce's papers, as well as some indications from Ernie Pyle's collection. But thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Stephen. Your work with the archival record gives us both this personal and strategic impact of Ieshima, and it's also a really sobering lesson of how deeply civilians can be drawn into the fight. So thank you again. And for our final theme, we're now moving from the land to the sea, where the Japanese unleashed a tactic unlike anything the U.S. Navy had ever faced before. So let's welcome our final speaker. Jon Parshall is an independent World War II scholar, co-author of the acclaimed Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway, and is a virtual historian here at the National Museum of the Pacific War. He has contributed to numerous military journals and documentaries, and today he's going to take us inside the Kamikaze campaign at Okinawa. So take it away, Jon.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am going to be talking today about kamikazes at Okinawa, which is one of the most prominent features of this particular battle, certainly in the naval sense. But before we do that, kind of have to talk about, where did the whole kamikaze thing come from, and what were some of the early operations the kamikazes were involved in. And so I want to look at that as well in the Philippines. Then we'll get to Okinawa. And then I'm going to sum it up at the end with a brief evaluation of the effectiveness of this particular weapon system. When I think about the kamikaze, I think about an intersection between an immovable military culture and an irresistible threat environment. And so, of course, the Japanese have been influenced by hundreds of years worth of samurai warriors and the Bushido code that came out of that sort of military ethos. And that whole thing gets transported into the Meiji Restoration and the founding of modern Japan. So, for instance, you see this famous line from the Imperial Rescript for Soldiers and Sailors that duty is weightier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather. And so you sort of carry that ethos forward and combine it with an educational system within Japan that is highly militarized and is churning out large masses of young men that have been steeped in this whole sort of ethos. And the result is this, which I just love this photograph because it perfectly encapsulates, you've got 5 young men standing in front of a very modern piece of military kit, and all of them are wearing samurai swords, right? So you've got this juxtaposition of the ancient with the modern. Unfortunately for these guys, they are operating in a threat environment which bears no resemblance to the one that existed at the beginning of the Second World War. So if you take a quick look at that, by the time we get to middle of 1944, the Americans are operating, of course, very good second-generation fighters like the Hellcat and the Corsair. All of those fighter directions are being coordinated within combat information centers on the aircraft carriers, which means that whereas back in 1942, the intercept range might have been 20, 25 miles. By the time you get to 1944, we're doing intercepts 60 miles, 80 miles, in some cases 100 miles, which means that if you are a Japanese aviator, you've got to somehow run this gauntlet, which is 3 or 4 times what it used to be back in the good old days, before you can even get within attack range of an American ship. And even if you make it to that point, you're going to be faced with this fantastic menagerie of defensive gunfire, including the 5-inch 38, which is hands down the best heavy flat gun of the war, and large quantities of the 40-millimeter Bofors, which likewise is the best anti-aircraft automatic weapon of the war. Not only that, but a lot of these weapons are now being radar fire controlled, which means that their lethality is increased just that much more. So if you take a look at sort of a nominal American carrier task force in 1942, one of the ways that you can think about the lethality of an airspace is to look at what I would call the throw weight. How much raw weight of explosives can an American formation put up in, say, a minute's time? So this American carrier task force has got a carrier in the middle, a couple of cruisers, a quartet of destroyers. This formation can put up about 32,000 pounds per minute worth of ordnance, which is already more than double what a similar Japanese carrier task force would have been able to do. But by the time you fast forward to the middle of 1944, maybe sub in one of our fast battleships, what you see is that throw weight has now gone up to 162,000 pounds per minute, mostly in the form of automatic weapons. So that's about a 5-fold increase in 2 years worth of warfare. But it's even worse than that, actually, because all of the 5-inch guns are now using the VT fuse, which increases the lethality of that particular weapon by a factor between 5 and 7. And so if you multiply that out, that means that this formation now is throwing up more than 500,000 pounds per minute of nominal throw weight, okay? So what's happened here is that the U.S. Navy has created the most lethal anti-aircraft environment on the planet. And with all due respect to, the 8th Air Force aviators who had to fly through some very heavy flak environments in places like Bremen or the Ruhr, they didn't have to come down to, 500 feet to do their business against an American ship, nor were the Germans using the VT fuse. There's just no comparison. So whereas, a raid against someplace like Schweinfurt, for instance, would extract 10 or 12% casualties, the Japanese are now routinely suffering 50, 60, 70% of their aircraft lost. Just getting anywhere near an American carrier task force is basically the same thing as writing your own death warrant. And the result of that is that the Japanese are now no longer receiving commensurate return for their investment in naval training. It just doesn't make any sense to train a guy for 18 months or 2 years and throw his life away in the course of 1 or 2 sorties. And this becomes very apparent by about the end of the Battle of Philippine Sea in June 1944. And at that point, the Japanese are looking around and like, how do we make lemonade out of these lemons? Enter this guy, Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro, who is the commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines. And it's his job to try to figure out some way of stopping the American carrier task force. And what ends up happening is he waltzes into the headquarters of 201st Air Group on October the 19th and asks for volunteers to do what he calls special attack or TOCO attacks against American ships. He comes away with a group of 24 very well-trained aviators, and they carry out their first attack on the 25th. And it's highly successful. So here's a picture of the escort carrier Sanlo being demolished by a kamikaze. And these first operations are going great guns. And so by the time you get to the end of the Philippines campaign, 23 American ships will have been sunk, including a couple of escort carriers and 3 destroyers. Another 113 damaged, 2,500 American sailors killed, and 3,400 wounded. And at this point, Onishi basically doubles down. TOCO attacks now very quickly become mainstream. This is the normal way of doing business. And in the course of doing that, of course, the quality of their aviators, which is none too good at this point in the war, drops off markedly. So what you see happening is that the better Japanese aviators are being reserved for doing things like running escorts and doing scouting missions, whereas the real cannon fodder are being put into the cockpits for these TOCO attacks. And that brings us to Okinawa. In a nutshell, the whole battle plan for Okinawa, for both the Navy and the Army, is a gigantic act of suicide. The Okinawa campaign is viewed from the outset as being one which they know they're not going to be able to repel the Americans, but the whole goal here is to buy time for the home islands to prepare for an invasion that they know is coming. So when the invasion goes down on the 1st of April, it provokes an all-out Japanese effort to defeat that invasion force. The first, and in some ways most famous incident in that is Operation Ten Ichigo, which happens on the 7th of April and involves the super battleship Yamato and a group of 9 other warships that try to make their way down to Okinawa, and of course are just demolished by an American carrier task force that sends hundreds of aircraft after them. And at the end of that 2-hour ordeal, Yamato rolls over and explodes, and that is effectively the end of the Japanese Navy. 6 of those 10 warships are sunk, including Yamato and Yahagi. Over 4,200 sailors are lost, including more than 3,000 from Yamato. Only a handful are rescued. The American losses in the meantime are just 10 aircraft and 12 crewmen, meaning that we inflicted a kill ratio of roughly 350 to 1. I can't think of another example in this war, or hardly any war, of a walkover of that magnitude. Meanwhile, this campaign is also going to see the introduction of other suicide weapons, such as the Kaiten, which is a suicide torpedo, the Shinyo, which is basically a speedboat that's got a 500-pound bomb in the nose. This is the first introduction of the Oka rocket-powered bomb, which is basically a human-guided missile, if you will, that is carried into battle on a Mitsubishi Betty medium bomber. And of course, the Americans very quickly figure out that the most efficacious way of defeating the Oka is to shoot down the Betty bomber before it gets anywhere near to the carrier fleet. But probably the most prominent new tactic that the Japanese are using is what they call kikasui, which are these massed attacks which are intended to swamp American air defenses. And this features coordinated strikes between both the Army and the Navy. And so you can see here, the first Kikasui raids are very, very large, including Kikasui 1, which happens at the same time that Yamato is going to her doom, of more than 350 suicide planes. And there's a commensurate number of conventional attacks that are going on at the same time, too. So you can see these are very, very busy days for the Americans when they may be getting hit with 500, 600, 700 Japanese aircraft coming in to swamp our defenses. One of our responses then is to set up radar pickets around Okinawa to give early warning of these raids that are coming in against the landing beaches. And as you can imagine, the radar picket stations that are closest to Japan become very, very heavily attacked areas. And quickly, radar picket duty becomes the most dangerous duty in the American fleet. You basically got a small group of warships which have to stay very close to a designated spot in the ocean, so they can't maneuver very well. They are under constant attack sometimes. The men are at general quarters for hours, sometimes days, getting only a handful of hours of sleep a night. Combat fatigue sets in. This is really, really hard duty. So if you take a look at just one of these typical radar pickets, you might find one or two destroyers, maybe some LCI and LCS gunships to provide local point defense. And again, just in terms of throw weight, these are actually relatively lethal little formations. Each one of those destroyers can put up as much weight of shell as the Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto could in 1943. Okay. And of course, when you factor in the VT fusing that those destroyers are using in their 5-inch guns, 90,000 pounds per minute worth of ordnance, that's a lot of ordnance. But the problem is that the Japanese likewise have evolved their tactics. So these aircraft are coming in multiple altitudes from multiple vectors. And given that there's only one 5-inch gun director on each of these destroyers, you can see that it is relatively easy to swamp these destroyers if you can attack them with multiple aircraft at the same time. Meaning that, according to this report from Ernest King's office, the suicide attack represents by far the most difficult anti-aircraft problem yet faced by the fleet, and the results show it. So here we have some pictures of some of the destroyers that managed to live through their ordeals. Many of them did not. The USS Hazelwood, with her bridge completely demolished, her commanding officer was killed along with several other senior officers. Here's the USS Laffey, which was very heavily hit towards the rear. By the end of this campaign, the Americans will have lost 28 ships to kamikazes, including 10 destroyers, mostly at those radar picket stations. Another 368 ships have been damaged, 5,000 American sailors killed, another 5,000 wounded. This is by far the heaviest combat that the U.S. Navy has been involved in since their ordeal around Guadalcanal. On the other hand, the Japanese lose almost 8,000 aircraft in the course of this 2.5-month campaign, either expended as kamikazes, lost in conventional attacks, lost just in operational accidents and that sort of thing, or destroyed on the ground by carrier raids and B-29s. In terms of the effectiveness of this whole thing, any way you slice it, a suicide attack was a more effective method than trying to, say, drop a dumb bomb on a ship. It's a more accurate weapon system, and it does more damage if it hits you than just a bomb will, because you've got the plane and the fuel in the plane as well. But the bottom line is, too, that just because you've increased the tactical effectiveness of your Air Force in no way affects the war's overall strategic balance, and that the Americans can absorb these losses, painful as they are, and still go on to victory. From the Japanese side, though, what you see is that they dramatically overestimate the effectiveness of their special attacks. So they claim that they sank 44 warships, including a number of fleet carriers and American battleships, when the actual toll was just 28 and nothing larger than a destroyer. So you have all sorts of instances of just wishful thinking on the part of the Japanese. This quote from Admiral Ugaki's diary that we didn't know the results of our attack because we couldn't get close enough to see them. But judging from the enemy radio chatter, it was almost certain that we destroyed 4 carriers, which is, a battle damage assessment that is hardly worthy of the name. And yet they accept this sort of wildly over-optimistic information at face value over and over and over again, which leads to what I would call a delusional feedback loop, in that the Japanese believe that they're hurting us far more badly than they actually are. This validates their strategically ineffective tactics, which then leads them to double down yet again to try to win this war. And that is going to directly impact war termination scenarios. How do we get them to stop fighting when they think that they are hurting us much more badly than they actually are? The result of that, of course, is going to be the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jon. It's such an interesting look at the tactics. And thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your expertise this afternoon. We've seen Okinawa today through the eyes of commanders, soldiers, sailors, and in doing so, we've also seen why it remains such a defining moment of the Pacific War, even 80 years later. And now we want to hear from you, so please submit your questions to the comments section on the right of your screen. Jon, who will be assisting as moderator, and I will try to address as many questions as time will allow. So let's begin.
I just wanted to dish one off immediately to Chris. We have a question regarding General Buckner. Did he have any memories of his father that were carried forward? His dad was a CSA general.
Considerable. I give a whole presentation where the basic theme is to understand Buckner Jr., you have to understand his father. His father lived until 1914. And Buckner Jr. was born in 1886. His father helped get him into West Point on a presidential appointment because of his friends with Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, there's a lot of different influences. If you look at the personal correspondence, you can see how dad is living through son's eyes at West Point. And just to put a fine point on it, because this is a whole presentation in itself, Buckner in his diary on April 1st, 1945, notes that April 1st is the anniversary of his father's birth. April 1st, 1823 was his father's birthday. So if you want to know to me, says so much about the impact of father and the example of father on son.
Interesting. I'm just going to ask sort of a follow-up too. We have another question here just talking about the post-war reputation of General Buckner. You know, you have this juxtaposition of him as being sort of methodical and steady, and on the other side, looking at sort of plotting and casualty blind. And I will not hide from you, Chris, that I have always sort of been in the latter camp, I got to say, having been to Okinawa a couple of times myself. But where do you come down on his post-war legacy?
Buckner was planning to write a memoir, and his death removed 2 chapters of the Pacific War, or greatly diminished our understanding of 2 chapters of the Pacific War, the war in Alaska and the Battle of Okinawa, because it removed his voice, and he couldn't get into those debates for obvious reasons. If you read his writings very closely, it illuminates his thinking in the battle, and that's where I get my interpretation from. There's a lot of people that from the outside looking in have imposed, what Buckner was one of those, he kind of played his thoughts to his chest, close to the vest. And that created a problem because until he made a decision, he kind of kept his thought process to himself and his diary.
Mm-hmm.
And so not having his diary available for so many years, the family actually didn't really donate it to anybody to the Eisenhower Presidential Library until 1990. So it hasn't been available that long. And into that vacuum, people were able to put what they wanted based on, his public statements, based on the evidence that they had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was going to sort of wrap a couple of questions regarding Ieshima up in a bow here. I, too, thought that your maps were fantastic, and I really enjoyed those. And we have sort of a follow-on question, regarding suggestions for using entry-level maps of circa 1945 Okinawa. So where did you get all of those maps from? And are there resources out there that are publicly available that you would suggest beyond just the official histories, I guess I would say, to go looking for good maps?
I can kind of jump in on that a little bit.
Yeah.
A lot of our maps that we get here at USAHEC, ironically, are donated through either private collections or our larger chief of staff of the Army collections that come in. And to use them in perspective is sometimes if we have association of just kind of the manuscript collections that these maps come from, there's probably some documentation in terms of map overlays that kind of go in a little bit more detail about how to use them. But finding the like little penciled in items on the map is sometimes one of the best ways to use as a teaching tool, because the overlays not only show kind of how these maps can be used in terms of aerial analysis or potential combat operations, but having all those pieces together can help out with that. And we digitized a lot of them. So having the digital maps, kind of finding battle maps that you can find online. I know Chris put online the official history of Okinawa, has a lot of great maps in that as well. So finding what we call them the green books, those green books have some excellent maps that use and place those maps in the context.
Yeah, I've actually tried assembling sort of a composite map of Okinawa myself, because I'm still unclear on where some of the hills that get mentioned in the regimental and divisional histories actually are. You know, I've been to Kakuzu, I've been to you know, some of the better touristy places, I guess I would say, in Okinawa, but other sites, particularly in the context of the fact that Naha, the city itself, is just basically mushroomed across all of southern Okinawa. It's really tough to place a lot of these places anymore. I was also going to mention University of Texas has a really good map collection that's online as well. So anybody who's looking for that kind of stuff. Any other stuff on maps that the three of us nerds want to throw out there? Chris?
Completely underrated source. 10th Army G2 compiled a tremendous report after the battle. There's a copy at the National Archives. There's a copy at the MacArthur Memorial too. And in it, they do a precise layout of all the Japanese defenses, and they do a very interesting terrain analysis after the battle and focus on what they knew and what they didn't know and found out later. So I would recommend, if you want to go that deep, I would recommend going and getting that report too.
Has that been digitized?
Not to my knowledge. The National Archives may have. The MacArthur Memorial has not.
Okay. Yeah, because Jim Zobel is the main man at the MacArthur, right? And so I should bust his chops and say, when are you going to digitize this? Follow-up question for Chris: did American artillery on Okinawa use proximity fuses?
The short answer is yes. It was one of the ways, as if you've studied the battle, and particularly some of the aspects of it, like Sugarloaf Hill, the Japanese were very good at the reverse slope defense. In other words, massing most of their troops on the backside, where American forces and American artillery fire couldn't always get to them easily until we started using VT fuses. And that's one of the ways it helps turn the tide, and particularly in the battles around Shuri. There was never quite enough ammunition. As a matter of fact, one of the ammunition ships, John, the Kamikazes, knock out one of the two main ammunition ships in early April. And so 10th Army was running low of our artillery ammunition until mid-May. But once they get that shortage is solved, from then on out, VT fuses are a full part of the arsenal for American artillery.
Got it. I'm going to pivot now to stuff for me, talking about Kamikazes. And actually, I want to give a little shout out to our guest from Britain, who piped in from Faversham, England. I've been there. I've drunk your Spitfire ale. And so now let's turn to topics aeronautical. Were kamikaze planes equipped with machine guns? Yes, they were. Were those pilots trained? Yeah, probably in a fairly cursory fashion, I would say. You know, it was not uniform that these aviators were inexperienced. There were a lot of really green pilots behind those sticks, but there were, you know, occasionally some fairly experienced guys too. Although, as I said, a lot of the more experienced aviators were being held back and used for escort missions and scouting missions and that kind of stuff, where you actually had to know how to navigate over water, among other things. So in any case, reasonably certain that those planes were armed. Another question regarding what airfields were the Japanese flying out of later on in the war. The two biggies in the south of Japan that are close to Kagoshima are Kanoya Air Base for the Navy and the Chiron Air Base for the Army. And in some of the tours that I do for the World War II Museum, I shouldn't even mention that here on the museum's channel, but anyway, we go there and we go to the Chiron Museum. It's a fascinating place. And gives you a real glimpse into what the last days of a lot of these very young pilots were like, living in little shanties next to the airfield and never knowing when it was that they were going to have to hop into the cockpit of that plane and take off on a one-way mission. Let's see here. Did the military downplay to the American public the effectiveness of the kamikaze attacks so as not to alarm the public? I don't know. And I would be, if Chris or Steve, either of you know the answer to that, I would love to hear it.
I haven't seen any reports about that either.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that they did, and I haven't necessarily seen that they didn't. But based on, let's put it this way, based on some of the headlines about the battle that were going on in the newspapers in May and June, the people in the United States were getting a pretty clear picture of what was going on in Okinawa.
Mm-hmm.
So, make of that what you will.
Yeah. And I would just say, too, that the easiest, quickest way to find that out, honestly, and this is a tool I use constantly, is to go look at the New York Times archives of news articles, the New York Times machine. That'll give you the skinny on the level of reporting around that particular threat. We had a follow-on question regarding how did our naval ships not run out of ammunition with these sort of relentless attacks that they were under? Well, we are moving them in and out of those radar picket stations on, they're only there for a day or two at a time. And by this point, naval resupply, we've really got this down to an art form. And so I'm sure there were occasions under some of those attacks where, yes, our ships would have started to have a real problem with ammunition. But as a whole, we were able to keep our ships in supply. Had a follow-up comment from Nicole Bagley, who is the director of the curator, the main curator at the Nimitz Museum, who mentions that the National Museum of the Pacific War has a few maps on Okinawa currently digitized on UNT's portal to Texas history. And so they are looking to grow that digital collection, and that would be another resource for people that are interested in looking for good maps of this particular battle. Last thing I failed to mention was regarding what kind of aircraft were the Japanese flying during these kamikaze attacks. And yes, it very much was a mishmash of aircraft that they were using, anything that could fly. You did see, sort of the classic kamikaze is a Zero with a 550-pound bomb underneath it. But you're seeing the Japanese using pretty much anything that was in the kit at this point. Val dive bombers, which were really outdated by this point in time. Even training aircraft, scouting aircraft, there was a whole mishmash. Of course, the other thing that's going on in the background is that despite the fact that they expended about 8,000 planes during this attack, they still had held back about 10,000 for the ultimate defense of the home islands, and at least half of those were dedicated to kamikaze operations. Anything else? I see a follow-up question here from my friend Merlin regarding the software I use to make maps and articles and presentations. That's a whole presentation unto itself. It's a mixture of, I have a custom tool that I use for doing Google terrain captures. I use Photoshop. I use a vector drawing tool. It's a whole thing. So if you're interested in that, send me a beer and we can talk further. So,
all right. Do you have any more questions out there? Feels like we're winding down a little bit.
Yeah, we just blew through them.
I know. I'm kind of disappointed. I could hear you guys talk all day. All right. Well, if that's it, on behalf of the National Museum of the Pacific War and the United States Army Heritage and Education Center, I want to thank our speakers, Christopher Kolakowski, Stephen Simmel, and Jonathan Parshall again. And of course, I want to thank all of you. I've been reading the comments and you had so many lovely things to say. So thank you so much. Today, through the themes of command, combat, and kamikazes, we've seen how 80 years later, the Battle of Okinawa still challenges us to consider the cost of war and the decisions that will shape history. And as we approach the 80th anniversary of the end of the war, we hope that you'll join us again on September 2nd for our in-person VJ Day commemoration, where you'll have the chance to hear Jon again. He will be our keynote. And then he will also be joining us on September 3rd for our webinar titled Enduring the Unendurable, Japan's Decision for Peace, 1945. And this will be 1 o'clock Central Time, and you can register for it right now on our website. Until then, please connect with us on social media. Explore our website for more programs and resources. Nicole mentioned our portal. We have so many of our archives digitized right now. And then also thank you and help us keep these stories alive. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next time.